Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, and honestly, I appreciate every single one of you for being here tonight. Before you drift off, do me a small favor. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I always love reading those. You'd be surprised how many of us are scattered all over the world, lying in the dark, listening to the same story at the same time. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help more than you know. Now, let's get comfortable, settle in, pull the blankets up, relax, take a deep breath, and let me take you to a place called Tinley Park. It's a suburb. One of those quiet, predictable suburbs about 30 miles south of Chicago, Illinois. The kind of place where you drive past strip malls and chain restaurants, and rows of brick houses with basketball hoops in the driveways. The kind of place where people move specifically because they want safety. Because they want to get away from the chaos of the city. Because they want to raise their kids somewhere calm, somewhere boring. Somewhere where the most exciting thing that happens on a Saturday morning is a sale at the local department store. Tinley Park, Illinois. Population around 56,000 in 2008. A solid middle-class community. A place where neighbors knew each other. Where people went to church on Sundays and mowed their lawns on Saturdays. Where the local shopping center, the Brookside Marketplace, sat at the corner of Line 91st Street and Harlem Avenue like it had been there forever. It had a Target, a PetSmart, a handful of smaller shops, and tucked in among all of them, a Lane Bryant clothing store. Lane Bryant, if you're not familiar, it's a women's clothing chain, has been around since the early 1900s. They specialize in plus-size fashion. Clothes for full-figured women. And the store in Tinley Park was exactly what you'd picture. A modest retail space in a suburban shopping center, glass front doors, racks of dresses and blouses and jeans, a couple of fitting rooms in the back, 2 cash registers up front, maybe $200 in each register on any given day. That's it, $400 total, at most. Not exactly the kind of place you'd think of as a target for anything sinister. The women who worked there loved it. They really did. One former employee would later describe it as a family. They took pride in helping their customers feel good about themselves, making women feel beautiful, finding the right fit, the right color, the right outfit for a night out or a job interview or just a regular Tuesday. It was a small store with a big heart, and on the morning of Saturday, February 7, 2008, that small store with a big heart was about to become the scene of one of the most horrifying and baffling crimes in the history of the Chicago area. A crime so brazen, so senseless, so devastating that it would haunt the families of the victims, the community of Tinley Park, and the entire region for years, for decades. A crime that, to this very day, remains completely and utterly unsolved. 5 women were going to die that morning. 5 women who had absolutely no reason to be afraid when they woke up. 5 women who were just going about their normal Saturday routines, shopping for clothes, picking up an outfit for a party, buying work clothes, just living their lives. And a 6th woman was going to be shot in the neck and left for dead on a cold concrete floor. She would survive. She would play dead while the blood pooled beneath her. She would become the only living witness to what happened in that back room. And the story she would tell the police would be one of the most chilling accounts they had ever heard. But before I tell you what happened inside that store, I need you to understand who these women were. Because they weren't just victims. They weren't just names in a news article. They were mothers and sisters and daughters and wives and friends. They had plans and dreams and people who loved them and people who needed them to come home. And not a single one of them came home that day. Let me start with the woman who wasn't even supposed to be there. Rhoda McFarland was born on January 10, 1966, in Joliet, Illinois. Joliet sits right on the outskirts of the Chicago metro area, a working-class city with a lot of grit and a lot of heart. Rhoda grew up there in a big family. She had 3 brothers and 1 sister. And from the very beginning, she was the kind of person who stood out. Not because she was loud or flashy, but because she genuinely, deeply, truly cared about people. It was in her bones. After graduating from Lyons Township High School in 1984, Rhoda did something that told you everything you needed to know about her character. She enlisted in the United States Air Force. She didn't just serve. She became a nurse practitioner. She was stationed at Andrews Air Force Base over in Prince George's County, Maryland, and she spent about 3 years there learning discipline, learning service, learning how to take care of people in ways that most of us never have to. After her active duty ended, she stayed in the Air Force Reserves, because that's who Rhoda was. She didn't just do things halfway. She committed. When she came back to the Chicago area, Rhoda poured herself into her church. She became the pastoral assistant at the Embassy Christian Center in Crest Hill, which was just a few miles from Joliet. And at the church, she thrived. She started youth programs. She helped integrate former inmates back into society. She created a project called Princess Unveiled, which was designed to help young girls prepare for adulthood, to teach them about self-worth and confidence and the kind of inner strength that Rhoda herself carried every single day. Eventually, Rhoda became ordained. She was a full minister. This woman who had served her country, who had helped the less fortunate, who had built programs from nothing, was now leading a congregation. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, even at people who seem like they have it all figured out. A disagreement with the church leadership led to Rhoda leaving her position, and suddenly, in her mid-40s, with a divorce already behind her, she found herself starting over. Again, she worked for Nicker Gas for a while, a local energy company. She started dating a man named Stuart Gibbs, and within a couple of years, Stuart and Rhoda were engaged. Things were looking up. She had found love again. She had a second chance at happiness. And somewhere in the middle of all that rebuilding, she took a job at Bryant. It was supposed to be temporary. Just something to pay the bills while she figured out her next move. But then they offered her the manager position, and something clicked. Rhoda discovered that she loved the work. She loved helping women find clothes that made them feel confident. She loved running the store. She loved her employees. And she kept up her charitable side, too, using her store discount to buy clothing for women who couldn't afford it. Because that's who Rhoda Hamilton McFarland was. She gave. It's what she did. It's what she always did. Her brother Maurice would later tell reporters about her, and the way he described her tells you everything. He said she was the kind of person who, if she only had $1 and you needed $1, she'd give it to you without even thinking about it, without asking for anything in return. That was Rhoda. Now, here's what you need to understand about why February said 2008 was different. Rhoda was not scheduled to work that day. It was a Saturday. The store had a clearance sale coming up. Flyers had been mailed out. Rhoda knew her skeleton crew was going to be overwhelmed, and she couldn't stand the thought of her employees struggling without help. So she came in anyway. She showed up that cold February morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because her people needed her. That decision, that selfless, generous, completely in character decision to show up for someone else, is what put Rhoda McFarland in that store on the morning she died. And if that doesn't break your heart, I don't know what will. The only other employee in the store that morning was a 33-year-old woman whose identity has been protected by police ever since. She's been referred to in some reports simply as Martha, though that's not her real name. She was a part-time employee who worked at Bryant on the weekends while she pursued her nursing degree during the week. She had been scheduled to open the store by herself that Saturday morning. Just her. Alone. In a store with barely $400 in the registers. When Rhoda showed up to help, this young woman must have been relieved. 2 was better than 1. Especially on a day when they expected a rush of customers looking for clearance deals. The 2 women opened the doors of Bryant at 11 a.m. sharp, and within minutes, the first customers of the day started trickling in. Now let me tell you about those customers. Let me tell you about the women who walked into that store that morning, just looking for something to wear. Sarah Safransky was only 22 years old. 22. She was the youngest person in that store that morning, and she had her entire life spread out in front of her like a blank page waiting to be written. Sarah was the oldest of 3 children, and she had grown up in Oak Forest, Illinois, a small suburb not far from Tinley Park. She went to St. Damian's, a private Catholic high school. where she was the kind of student that every teacher remembered. She was in the academic talented program. She was a mathlete. She was in the Interact Club and the Spanish Club and an organization called Safari. She wasn't just smart. She was involved. She was curious. She was the kind of young woman who wanted to do everything and be part of everything. And she was a homebody too. She loved board games. She loved spending quiet weekends with her boyfriend, Bryant. She wasn't out partying or chasing thrills. She was content. She was happy in a simple, pure way that a lot of people twice her age never figure out. Sarah had graduated from Northern Illinois University just the previous May in 2007. She had earned her degree and she had already landed a job at Sienna Financial Corporation in Chicago. She was about to start her career. Her real adult life was about to begin. And the reason she was at Lane Bryant that morning was so perfectly ordinary that it hurts to think about. She needed winter work clothes. That's it. She was shopping for outfits to wear to her new job. Professional clothes, maybe a blouse, maybe a pair of slack. The kind of shopping trip that takes an hour, and then you go home and hang everything up in the closet, and don't think about it again. Sarah's family would later release a statement that said their emotions were raw and they were still in shock. They said there was nothing adequate anyone could say. They described Sarah as someone who was loved by all who knew her. And they were counting on that love to sustain them while they mourned. 22 years old, shopping for work clothes. Gone. Carrie Hudek Chuso was 33. She lived in Frankfort, Illinois, another one of those pleasant Chicago suburbs where you can raise a family and feel safe. Carrie was a graduate of both DePaul University and Loyola, where she had earned her bachelor's and master's degrees respectively. She was brilliant, educated, driven. And she used all of that education and drive to do something that mattered. She became a social worker. Carrie worked with at-risk youth at Homewood, Flossmoor High School, the same high school she had graduated from over a decade earlier. She had gone away, gotten her degrees, and come back to help the kids in her own community. That tells you something about Carrie Chuso. She didn't take the easy path. She didn't chase the biggest paycheck. She went where she was needed. And the people who worked with her adored her. Vaughn Mansfield, the principal at Homewood Flossmoor, would later say that where people are ordinary, Carrie put extra in front of ordinary. She quietly was a part of all that they did. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't looking for recognition. She just showed up and made everything better by being there. Carrie had married her husband Tony less than 2 years before the shooting. They had gotten married in a church in Homewood. And they were happy. They were planning their future. They were talking about starting a family. They wanted kids. They were in that beautiful stage of marriage where everything feels possible, where the years ahead seem long and full of promise. On the evening of February 2nd, Carrie was supposed to meet up with some old classmates from DePaul for a night out. She needed an outfit. That's why she was at Lane Bryant that morning. She was picking something up to wear that night. Just a quick shopping trip before an evening with friends. She probably had the whole day planned out in her head. Shop in the morning. Maybe grab lunch. Get ready for the dinner. Meet the girls. Laugh about old times. She never made it to dinner. Connie Woolfolk was 37 years old and she lived in Flossmoor, Illinois, about 8 miles east of Tinley Park. Connie was a single mother with 2 sons. Her oldest was 16 and attended Homewood, Flossmoor High School, the same school where Carrie Chuso worked, though neither woman knew the other. Her youngest was just 10 years old, and he suffered from spina bifida, a condition that required an enormous amount of care and attention from Connie, and Connie gave it. She gave everything she had to those boys. She was working overnight shifts at Target to make ends meet. The same Target that shared a parking lot with Lane Bryant. She was also trying to build something more permanent. She and her mother had recently started a mortgage company together, hoping to create some financial stability for the family. Connie was hustling, she was grinding. She was doing what so many single mothers do every day without anyone noticing or applauding. She was keeping her family afloat through sheer willpower and love. Connie's sister, Dorothy Rice, would later describe her simply. She said Connie had a way of showing love. Pure love. That's how people remembered Connie Woolfolk. She loved fiercely. She fought for the people she cared about. She was strong in a way that didn't need to announce itself. On the morning of February 2nd, Connie was doing something rare and wonderful. She was treating herself. She had just come from getting a manicure and pedicure, her first in ages. That evening she was supposed to go to a birthday party at Ed and Joe's Pizza in Tinley Park with a group of girlfriends. A rare night out. A night where Connie could be just Connie, not mom, not the overnight worker, not the person holding everything together. Just a woman having fun with her friends. She stopped at Lane Bryant to pick up an outfit for the party. Something cute. Something that would make her feel good. She deserved that. After everything she did for everyone else. She deserved one Saturday where she could get her nails done and buy a new outfit and go dance with her friends. She walked into that store, and she never walked out. Jennifer Bishop was 34 years old, and unlike the other women, she wasn't from the Chicago area at all. Jennifer, who everyone called Jeannie, lived in South Bend, Indiana. She was a mother of 3 young children, all under the age of 8. 3 kids. 3 tiny humans who needed their mother more than they did anything else in the world. Janie was a nurse. An intensive care nurse at Memorial Hospital in South Bend, which is a level 2 trauma center. She had worked there for over a decade, starting from the bottom and working her way up to shift supervisor. She was the kind of nurse who took care of gunshot victims, car accident victims, the worst of the worst. She saw suffering every day, and she responded to it with compassion and skill and professionalism. Her supervisor, Nancy Pemberton, would later tell reporters that Jeannie had beautiful eyes, and that she was an exceptional person and an exceptional nurse, because she was so very caring of everyone. Think about that for a moment. A woman who spent her career saving the lives of trauma victims. A woman who treated gunshot wounds for a living. And she was killed by a gunshot. The cruelty of that irony is almost too much to bear. So why was Jeannie in Tinley Park that morning? Her husband Bryant was attending a work conference in the area. Jeannie had tagged along, probably happy for a change of scenery, a little break from the routine. While Bryant was at his conference, Jeannie decided to do some shopping, and she had just celebrated her 34th birthday a few days earlier. Someone in her family had given her a Lane Bryant gift card as a birthday present, a birthday gift card. That's what brought Jennifer Bishop to that store. A simple birthday present that was supposed to bring her a little bit of joy. Instead, it brought her to the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Now you know who was in that store. 2 employees and 4 customers. 6 women whose paths converged on a cold February morning in a suburban clothing store. 6 women who had no connection to each other except for the fact that they were all in the same place at the same time. 6 women who had absolutely no idea what was about to walk through the door. Let me take you to that morning, February 2nd, 2008. Groundhog Day, if you can believe that. The temperature in Tinley Park hovered in the mid-20s. It was one of those brutal Chicago area winter days where the cold hits you in the face the moment you step outside, where your breath turns to fog before it even leaves your mouth, where the sky is that flat, endless gray that makes you feel like the sun doesn't exist anymore. The Brookside Marketplace Shopping Center was coming to life slowly that Saturday morning, the way shopping centers do. The parking lot was mostly empty early on, with just a few cars scattered here and there. Target was open. PetSmart was open. The smaller stores were opening their doors one by one. At 100 a.m., Rhoda McFarlane and her part-time employee opened the front doors of Lane Bryant. The lights were on. The racks were full. The clearance sale signs were up. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly the way it should have been on a Saturday morning at a women's clothing store in suburban Illinois. Within the first few minutes, customers started to come in. Sarah Safransky was one of the first. She browsed the racks, looking through the winter work clothes, probably holding things up to herself and putting them back, the way you do when you're shopping and you're not quite sure what you want. Carrie Chirso came in too, looking for something to wear to her dinner that night. And then, at around 1:05 or 1:08 a.m., just minutes after the store opened, a man walked in. He came through the back entrance of the store. Not the front door where customers normally entered. The back, he was a black man of average to above average height, about 6 feet to 6'2". He had a husky build with broad shoulders. His hair was done up in cornrows, maybe 3 to 5 of them, pulled toward the back of his head. One single braid hung down over his right cheek, and at the end of that braid were 4 small light green beads. He was wearing a dark colored waist-length jacket, black jeans with embroidery on the back pockets that looked like a cursive letter G with rhinestones, and a charcoal gray knit cap. He was well groomed. One detail that the surviving employee would later tell police was that his fingernails were manicured. Clean. Taken care of. This was a man who paid attention to his appearance, and he was carrying something, a stack of papers, like a delivery man would carry. He approached the 2 employees, Rhoda and Martha, and he started talking, casually, conversationally. He told them he had a delivery. He was acting like this was the most normal thing in the world, just a guy dropping off a package doing his job. But Rhoda McFarlane was the store manager. She knew the schedule. She knew that no delivery was expected that day. Something didn't add up. Rhoda picked up the phone and called another Lane Bryant location nearby to ask if they knew anything about a delivery. She was being careful. She was being responsible. She was doing exactly what a good manager should do when something seems a little off. Minutes passed. The man kept talking. He kept up the delivery man act. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. He was inside that store for a long time before anything happened. And during those 15 or so minutes, the first customers were shopping. The employees were trying to figure out this delivery situation. And the man was just standing there, biding his time. And then, without warning, the act dropped. The man pulled a gun from his pocket. It was a .40 caliber Glock pistol. And in an instant the Saturday morning shopping trip became a nightmare. He started yelling. He told the women this was a robbery. He demanded the money from the registers. He demanded their purses, their wallets, their cash, their jewelry. Everything they had on them. He was aggressive. He was loud. And the gun in his hand made every single word he said a direct threat to their lives. There were 4 women in the store at that point. Rhoda and Martha, the 2 employees, and 2 customers, Sarah Safransky and Carrie Chuso. The gunman herded all 4 of them at gunpoint toward the back of the store, past the fitting rooms, past the storage area, into a back room where customers never went, where there were no windows, where there was no escape. In that back room he forced the 4 women to lie face down on the floor. He had brought duct tape with him, which told the police something important later on. He had planned this. This wasn't a spontaneous robbery gone wrong. He came prepared. He came with tape. He came with a plan. He bound the women's hands with the duct tape. He restrained them, made them helpless. And then, in what can only be described as an act of deliberate degradation, he took underwear from a display on the sales floor and placed it over the women's heads. He was blindfolding them. He didn't want them to see his face. He didn't want them to see each other. He didn't want them to see what was coming, and during this time, the reports indicate that the gunman made a sexual advance toward at least one of the women. A grope, a deliberate, humiliating touch. Thankfully, it didn't escalate beyond that. None of the women were undressed. But the violation was real. The terror was real, and for those women, lying face down on a cold floor with their hands bound and underwear over their faces, the fear must have been absolutely paralyzing. Minutes continued to pass, and the front door of Lane Bryant kept opening, because from the outside nothing looked wrong. The store was open. The lights were on. The sign said welcome. Connie Woolfolk walked in. She had just come from getting her nails done. She was looking for a party outfit. She walked into what she thought was a clothing store and found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. Jennifer Bishop walked in shortly after. She had her Lane Bryant gift card, the birthday present. She was going to pick up some ice while her husband was at his conference. She walked in, and she too was confronted by the gunman. Both women were taken to the back room at gunpoint. Both were forced to the floor. Both were bound. But Connie Woolfolk did something that the others hadn't done. She fought back. Connie, the single mother who worked overnight shifts and cared for a son with spina bifida and loved fiercely and never backed down from anything, Connie Woolfolk fought. She resisted. She didn't go quietly, and the gunman responded with violence. He hit her, he pistol whipped her across the face. He beat her badly enough that her brother would later tell reporters that she was beat up pretty bad, that the gunman must have pistol whipped them. When they examined Connie's body later, they found bumps and bruises on her face. They found scratch marks on her body, and underneath her fingernails, they found blood. Blood that might not have been hers. Blood that might have belonged to the gunman himself. Connie Woolfolk had clawed at her attacker. She had drawn blood. She had fought to survive, fought to get back home to her 2 boys who needed her more than anything in the world. And it wasn't enough. Now there were 6 women in that back room, 2 employees and 4 customers, bound, blindfolded, lying face down on the floor of a suburban clothing store while a man with a gun paced around them. The gunman had been in the store for roughly 35 to 40 minutes by now. He had arrived just after 100 a.m., and it was now approaching 140. 40 minutes, that's an incredibly long time for a robbery. Most armed robberies are over in 2 or 3 minutes. The criminal comes in, grabs the money, and runs. But this man had been inside Lane Bryant for nearly 3/4 of an hour. He was in no hurry. He was taking his time. And as the minutes ticked by, something in his demeanor shifted. He was getting agitated. The calm, collected delivery man persona was crumbling. He was nervous, jittery. Whatever plan he had come in with, things were clearly not going the way he expected. Maybe it was the number of women. Maybe it was Connie's resistance. Maybe it was the amount of time that had passed. Whatever the reason, the gunman was losing control. And then Rhoda McFarland did something incredibly brave. Rhoda was wearing a Bluetooth headset, the kind you clip to your ear for hands-free phone calls. And somehow, lying on that floor with her hands bound, with a man with a gun standing over her, Rhoda managed to secretly dial 911. The call went first to the Will County Sheriff's Department. It was immediately transferred to Tinley Park Police, who had jurisdiction over the area. The call was received at 1:44 a.m. On that call, you can hear Rhoda's voice, whispering. Terrified, she managed to say the location, Lane Bryant, Tinley Park, and then 2 words that will haunt anyone who has ever listened to that recording: hurry, please hurry. In the background of that call, you can hear the muffled voice of the gunman, his voice. The voice of the man who killed 5 women. The voice that police have released to the public in the hope that someone, somewhere, will recognize it. The 911 operator told Rhoda to stay on the line, but the connection was lost. Whether the gunman discovered what Rhoda was doing, whether the call simply dropped, nobody knows for certain. But what is believed, what the evidence suggests, is that the gunman realized Rhoda had called for help, and that's when he started shooting. Moments after Rhoda McFarland whispered her desperate plea for help into that Bluetooth headset, the gunman opened fire on all 6 women, one by one, execution style. They were lying face down on the floor. They were bound. They were blindfolded. They couldn't run. They couldn't fight. They couldn't even see it coming. 5 of the 6 women died instantly, shot in the head at close range while lying defenseless on the floor of a clothing store backroom. But the 6th woman, Martha, the part-time employee, survived. In the fraction of a second before the gunman pulled the trigger on her, she turned her head. Just slightly. Just enough. The bullet that was meant to kill her struck her in the neck instead. It was a devastating wound, but it wasn't fatal. Martha lay still. She played dead. She lay there in the blood of her workers and customers, and she did not move. She did not breathe. She did not make a sound. The gunman, apparently satisfied that all 6 women were dead, turned and fled. He left the store. He disappeared into the cold February morning. And he has never been seen again. A Tinley Park police officer who happened to be on a call in the parking lot of the Target store, just a few hundred feet from Lane Bryant, was one of the first to respond. He arrived at the scene within a minute or 2 of the 911 call being received. But by the time he cautiously entered the store, weapon drawn, heart pounding, the gunman was already gone. The officer made his way through the store, past the racks of clothes, past the registers, past to the back room, and there on the floor, he found them, 5 women dead, 1 woman barely alive, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the neck. He called it in, and within minutes, The Brookside Marketplace Shopping Center became the scene of the largest law enforcement response that Tinley Park had ever seen. But for Rhoda McFarland, for Sarah Safransky, for Carrie Hudek-Chuso, for Connie Woolfolk, and for Jennifer Bishop, it was already too late. The question that would consume this community, these families, and law enforcement for years to come was simple but devastating. Who did this? And why? Those are the questions that remain unanswered to this day. And what happened next, the investigation that followed, the clues that were found, the leads that went nowhere, the sketch that was released, the voice on the 9/11 tape, the surveillance footage, the DNA under Connie Woolfolk's fingernails, all of it paints a picture of a case that should have been solved, a case that had a surviving witness, a case that had the full attention of the FBI, the Illinois State Police, the South Suburban Major Crimes Task Force, and the Tinley Park Police Department. And yet here we are, more than 18 years later, and the man who walked into that Bryant store on the morning of February 7, 2008, and executed 5 women in cold blood is still out there, still free, still unknown, and 5 families are still waiting for answers. Within minutes of that 9/11 call, the Brookside Marketplace Shopping Center transformed from a quiet suburban strip mall into one of the largest crime scenes the south suburbs of Chicago had ever seen. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment it was a lazy Saturday morning. The next it was a sea of flashing lights, police cruisers, ambulances, and officers with their hands on their holsters, faces grim, moving quickly and deliberately through the parking lot and the surrounding stores. The first officer on scene was a Tinley Park patrolman who had already been in the area, parked in the Target lot just a few hundred feet from Lane Bryant, handling an unrelated call. When the 9/11 dispatch came through, he was there in under 2 minutes. But when he reached the store, the gunman was already gone. The officer entered cautiously, not knowing if the shooter was still inside, not knowing what he was walking into. He cleared the front of the store, moved past the registers, past the racks of dresses and blouses and winter clearance items, past the fitting rooms, and then he reached the back. What he found in that back room is the kind of scene that stays with a person forever. 5 women face down on the floor, hands bound behind their backs with duct tape, shot in the head at close range, and a 6th woman, bleeding from her neck, who was still alive. Still conscious, still playing dead because she wasn't sure if the monster who had done this was still somewhere in the store. More officers arrived, then more, then the paramedics, then the fire department. Steve Klotz, who was the assistant fire chief at the time, would later describe arriving at the scene and learning that all 5 women were dead on arrival. He talked about the feeling of helplessness, the need to help, the training that tells you to save lives, and then the devastating realization that there was nothing that could be done for 5 of those 6 women. The initial impact, he said, was that you want to try to help. That's your number one goal. And when you find that you can't do anything, there's a sense of helplessness. Former Tinley Park Mayor Ed Zabrocki remembered driving to the scene after getting the call from then Police Chief Mike O'Connell. He rolled down his window, and the chief was standing there with tears in his eyes. He said, "Ed, we've got 5 dead." And Zabrocki said his heart sank. That image, a police chief with tears in his eyes on a freezing February morning, tells you everything about what this crime did to the people who had to respond to it. The Tinley Park Police Department immediately called in reinforcements. Officers from neighboring departments arrived. The Cook County Sheriff's Office responded. The South Suburban Major Crimes Task Force was activated. Within hours, the FBI's Chicago field office was also brought into the fold. This wasn't a routine call. This wasn't a break-in or a shoplifting incident. 5 women had been executed in a clothing store on a Saturday morning. This was a mass murder, and the killer had vanished. The first order of business was securing the scene and searching for the gunman. Officers locked down the entire Brookside Marketplace. Every store in that shopping center was swept. Target, PetSmart, every restaurant, every small business, every corner and back hallway and storage. Shoppers and employees in neighboring stores were told to stay put or to evacuate in an orderly fashion. Some shoppers in Target that morning, didn't even know what had happened until they saw police officers moving through aisles with their weapons drawn, eyes scanning, jaws set. And then there was Sean Tias. Sean was a young black man from Harvey, Illinois. He had driven to the Brookside marketplace that morning with his girlfriend, who was shopping inside Target. Sean was sitting in his car in the parking lot, waiting for her, doing absolutely nothing wrong, when police officers descended on him. They pulled him out of the car. They examined the soles of his shoes. They brought him to a nearby station and questioned him for over an hour. They asked him repeatedly, "Where is the gun?" They asked him if he had removed beads from his braided hair. They pressed him. They pushed him. And Sean Tias told them the truth. He told them that the police were already swarming the parking lot when he and his girlfriend had arrived. He told them he had nothing to do with whatever had happened. And eventually, after more than an hour of questioning, he was released. Because he was innocent. He was just a man sitting in a car waiting for his girlfriend. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his physical appearance, a black man with braided hair, matched the general description of the suspect just enough for the police to grab him. Sean Tias was cleared, but the real killer remained at large. Outside the shopping center, the search expanded rapidly. A police helicopter was brought in to scour the surrounding area from the air. Officers searched a frozen retention pond behind the marketplace, looking for a discarded weapon. They canvassed the neighborhood. They went door to door. They checked businesses up and down Winetiny First Street and Harlem Avenue. But here's the thing about the location of the Brookside Marketplace that made this search almost impossible from the start. The shopping center sits right off Interstate 80. It is minutes from one of the major east-west highways in America, a highway that stretches from New Jersey to California. If the gunman had a car waiting, if he had planned his escape even a fraction as well as he had planned the robbery, he could have been on that highway and miles away before the first officer even entered Lane Bryant. He could have been out of Tinley Park in 5 minutes. Out of Illinois within the hour. In another state by lunchtime, and that's exactly what investigators feared had happened. The killer hadn't hidden. He hadn't holed up in a neighboring store. He hadn't been caught on the perimeter. He had simply gotten into a vehicle and driven away, disappearing into the anonymity of the American highway system. But the police weren't without evidence, not entirely, because while the gunman had been careful, while he had spent 40 minutes controlling the scene and attempting to eliminate witnesses, he had left things behind, traces, fragments, small pieces of himself that would become the building blocks of an investigation that would consume years of work and thousands of hours of manpower. Let me walk you through what the investigators found. First, there was the surviving victim, the woman we've been calling Martha. She was rushed to a local hospital with a gunshot wound to the neck. It was a serious injury, but she was alive, she was conscious, and she had seen the killer's face. She had spent nearly 40 minutes in his presence. She had heard his voice. She had watched him move through the store. She had been closer to this man than perhaps anyone else who had ever survived an encounter with him. But Martha was in a fragile state, and police knew they had to be careful. Tinley Park Police Commander Rick Bruno described her as emotionally raw in those first days. He said they were interviewing her in stages because they needed to be mindful of how much she could tolerate. She had just watched 5 women die. She had been shot in the neck. She had played dead in a pool of blood while a murderer walked out the door. The trauma was immense and immediate, and investigators had to balance their desperate need for information with the very real possibility of re-traumatizing the only living witness to this crime. Over the following days and weeks, Martha worked closely with police to provide a detailed description of the gunman. And the picture she painted was remarkably specific. She described a black man, approximately 6 feet to 6 feet 2 inches tall with a husky build and broad shoulders. He had medium to dark skin. His hair was done in cornrows, 3 to 5 puffy cornrows pulled toward the back of his head, with one single braid hanging down over his right cheek. At the end of that braid were 4 small light green beads. He had a receding hairline. He was wearing a dark-colored waist-length jacket, black jeans with embroidery on the back pockets, something that resembled a cursive letter G with rhinestones, a charcoal gray knit cap or skull cap, and he appeared to be between 25 and 35 years old. One detail in particular stood out. Martha told police that the man's fingernails were manicured clean, well kept. This was not a disheveled, strung-out criminal grabbing quick cash for a drug fix. This was a man who took care of his appearance, who groomed himself carefully, who presented himself in a way that suggested either vanity or a deliberate effort to maintain a certain image. Based on Martha's description, police worked with the Illinois State Police to create a composite sketch of the suspect. This process took time. Investigators conducted multiple sessions with Martha, carefully drawing out details, refining the image, making sure that every line and shadow and proportion matched what she had seen with her own eyes that morning. The sketch was completed and released to the public on February 10, 2008, 8 days after the shooting. Within the first 24 hours of the sketch being made public, police received 24 tips. Within the first few days, that number climbed to over 80. The sketch was everywhere. It was on the news, it was in the newspapers. It was pinned up in police stations and community centers and coffee shops across the south suburbs. A mobile billboard with the sketch was even driven around downtown Chicago, parked outside Union Station, where thousands of commuters passed by it every day. The message was clear. Have you seen this man? Do you recognize this face? And then there was the 911 call. On February 19, 2008, a little over 2 weeks after the shooting, police released a portion of the 911 call that Rode had made from inside the store. They didn't release the entire recording. They held back most of it for investigative purposes. But what they did release was chilling enough to send a cold wave through the community. You could hear Rhoda's voice, whispering, urgent, terrified, saying the name of the store, saying the town, begging the dispatcher to hurry. And in the background, muffled but audible, you could hear the voice of the gunman. His voice, the actual voice of the man who murdered 5 women. It was distant, it was unclear, but it was there. And police hoped someone who had listened to that recording would recognize that voice. A mother, a girlfriend, a co-worker, a neighbor. Somebody who had heard that voice before and would hear it again on that 911 tape, and would feel a chill run down their spine and would pick up the phone and call the tip line. 6 days later, on February 25th, authorities announced they had been able to isolate the killer's voice on the 911 tape. Using audio enhancement technology, they had cleaned up the recording and separated the gunman's voice from the other sounds in the background. This was a significant piece of evidence, because even though the sketch showed what the killer looked like, the 911 tape showed what he sounded like. Between the two, police believed they had given the public enough to identify this man. A face and a voice. That should have been enough. But investigators also learned something else that they didn't share with the public for years. According to former U.S. Marshal Supervisory Inspector Ed Farrell, who worked on the case, there was more audio on that 911 tape than what was released. The full recording contained additional conversation, additional sounds, additional clues that investigators kept close to their chest. Farrell would later tell reporters that the whole tape hadn't been disclosed, that there was more than just that one small segment. This was a deliberate choice by police. They wanted to keep certain details secret, details that only the killer would know. Details that could be used to verify or eliminate suspects during interrogations. Then there was the surveillance footage. Lane Bryant itself did not have security cameras inside the store. That was a critical gap. There was no video of the gunman entering, no footage of the robbery, no recording of the shooting, nothing from inside. But there was one camera that captured something. A security camera mounted on the Target store across the parking lot had a partial view of the front of Lane Bryant. The footage was grainy. It was taken from a distance. It was far from ideal. But it showed something important. Right around the time of the shootings, 2 vehicles appeared in the parking lot near Lane Bryant. A dark-colored SUV and a smaller dark-colored sedan. Both vehicles pulled up around the same time, and both left around the same time, shortly after the shooting occurred. The timing was suspicious enough to catch the attention of investigators immediately. Ed Farrell would later describe this footage and suggest what many investigators already suspected. There was a theory, and it was a strong one, that the gunman had not acted alone, that he had accomplices, that the two vehicles had arrived to facilitate his escape, that while he was inside the store committing murder, there were other people outside, waiting, watching, ready to drive him away the moment he walked out that door. Think about that. If this theory is correct, then the Lane Bryant shooting wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was a coordinated operation. Multiple people were involved. Multiple people knew what was going to happen. And multiple people helped the killer escape. Which means multiple people have been carrying this secret for over 18 years. Someone out there knows who did this. Someone helped him get away. And that someone has stayed silent all this time. The surveillance footage was analyzed extensively. Investigators tried to enhance the video, tried to identify the make and model of the vehicles, tried to pull license plates from the grainy images, but the quality was poor. The distance was too great. The technology available in 2008 had its limits, and the footage, while tantalizing, ultimately didn't provide the clear identification that police needed. Now let's talk about the physical evidence inside the store. Police have been notably tight-lipped about exactly what forensic evidence was recovered from the Lane Bryant crime scene. This is deliberate. In an active investigation, particularly one that relies heavily on the possibility of a future confession or a tip from an insider, police often withhold forensic details. They don't want a suspect to know what they have. They don't want someone to be able to prepare an alibi or explain away the evidence before they're even sitting in an interrogation room. But over the years, a few details have emerged. We know that the murder weapon was a .40 caliber Glock pistol. We know that shell casings were recovered from the scene. We know that the women were bound with duct tape that the gunman had brought with him. And we know about the blood under Connie Wofolk's fingernails. Connie, the woman who fought back, who scratched and clawed at her attacker, who refused to go quietly. The blood beneath her nails may have been the killer's blood. And if it was, then police had his DNA. In fact, investigators have confirmed over the years that they do possess DNA evidence connected to the case. What hasn't been confirmed publicly is exactly where that DNA came from. Whether it was from Connie's fingernails, from a discarded item at the scene, from saliva on the duct tape, or from some other source entirely. Investigators have also not confirmed whether the DNA sample is large enough or clean enough to run through forensic databases like CODIS, the combined DNA index system that the FBI maintains. If the sample is degraded or partial, it may not be usable for a traditional database search. But if it's complete, then the killer's genetic fingerprint is sitting in a lab somewhere, waiting for a match, and there was more. Police examined the scene for fingerprints, shoe prints, hair samples, fibers, and any other trace evidence the gunman might have left behind. The duct tape itself was a potential goldmine of forensic evidence. It retains DNA from skin cells. It can even retain impressions from the surface it was torn against. Every piece of duct tape recovered from the scene was a potential link to the killer, but none of it led to an identification. Not immediately. Not in the first weeks. Not in the first months. The investigation was massive. The South Suburban Major Crimes Task Force took the lead, working alongside Tinley Park Police, the Illinois State Police, the FBI, the Will County State's Attorney's Office, and the Illinois Attorney General's Office. It was a multi-agency effort that pooled resources, manpower, and expertise from some of the most capable law enforcement organizations in the country. Detective Ray Violetto of the Tinley Park Police Department was assigned as the lead investigator, alongside his partner, Detective Tim Poulos. These two men would dedicate years of their careers to this case. Violetto would later describe the Lane Bryant investigation as the largest case he had ever been involved in, and he wasn't exaggerating. The volume of evidence, the number of tips, the sheer scope of the investigation was staggering, and the tips kept coming. In the first few weeks, they came in by the dozens, then the hundreds. By the time the case hit its first anniversary in February 2009, the police had received thousands of tips. By the 10-year mark, the number was over 7,000. People called the hotline to report suspicious men they had seen in their neighborhoods. They called to report ex-boyfriends or estranged family members who matched the description. They called because they had a gut feeling. They called because they wanted to help. Every single tip was logged and either pursued or cleared. On March 15, 2008, just 6 weeks after the shooting, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted, the nationally televised program hosted by John Walsh that specialized in profiling fugitives and unsolved crimes. The show reached millions of viewers across the country, and the phones lit up. More tips poured in, more names, more leads, more possibilities, but no arrest. A man in Nevada was questioned in connection with the case in March of 2008. He was ultimately cleared. The investigation reportedly turned to Texas in July of 2008, following a lead that seemed promising at the time. That lead also went cold. In September of 2008, the FBI returned to the Lane Bryant store itself to conduct additional forensic testing. By then, the store had been closed to the public since the shooting. It sat empty, a ghost in the middle of a busy shopping center, yellow police tape still visible through the glass doors. Nobody wanted to go in there. Nobody wanted to shop where 5 women had been murdered. On June 10, 2008, roughly 4 months after the shooting, police released an updated sketch of the suspect. This second sketch was created through additional sessions with Martha, the surviving victim, and was meant to provide a more refined likeness. The core description remained the same. The height, the build, the cornrows, the green beads, the dark jacket, the black jeans. But the face was slightly different. More detailed, more lifelike. Police hoped the new sketch would jog someone's memory, would trigger a recognition that the first sketch hadn't, and still no arrest. The community of Tinley Park was devastated. There's no other word for it. This was a place where people came to feel safe, and that sense of safety had been shattered in the most violent way imaginable. On February 17, 2008, just 2 weeks after the shooting, the town held a public memorial for the 5 victims. Hundreds of people attended. They lit candles. They said prayers. They left flowers outside the Lane Bryant store, piling them against the glass until the makeshift memorial became a wall of bouquets and cards and handwritten notes. Strangers drove from across the region to lay flowers and pay their respects to women they had never met. One woman named Lieber from Mocana came to place flowers at the memorial. She told reporters that she had no personal connection to the victims. She just wanted to say a prayer and show that she was thinking about them. That's what this crime did to people. It reached beyond the immediate circle of victims and families and touched the hearts of an entire community, of an entire region. The funerals were heartbreaking. Rhoda McFarlane was laid to rest first. 800 people packed themselves into the Word of Life Church in Crest Hill for her memorial. 800 people. For a woman who managed a clothing store. That tells you how many lives Rhoda had touched. Reverend Tim Bagwell spoke at her service and said something that would be repeated in various forms by many people in the weeks and months to come. He said her death has the ability to overshadow her life, and that should not be. She should not be remembered as a victim. Carrie Chuso was buried in the same church in Homewood, where she and her husband Tony had been married less than 2 years earlier. The joy of that wedding and the grief of that funeral, separated by barely 2 years, held in the same room. Tony Chuso, the young husband who had been planning to start a family with the love of his life, was now a widower. He would later honor Carrie's memory by following in her footsteps. He became a teacher. He went into the same kind of work that Carrie had devoted her career to, helping young people. Because that's what Carrie would have wanted. Sarah Safransky was mourned by a community of young people who couldn't believe that someone so vibrant, so smart, so full of promise, was gone at 22. Her friends from Northern Illinois University, her classmates from St. Damian's, her boyfriend Bryant. They all gathered to say goodbye to a woman who should have had decades ahead of her. She was supposed to start her career. She was supposed to build a life. She was supposed to grow old. Connie Woolfolk's family was devastated beyond measure. Her 2 sons had lost their mother. Her 10-year-old, the boy with spina bifida, who needed Connie more than he needed anyone, who depended on her for everything. He had to learn how to live in a world without the woman who had given him everything she had. Connie's family and friends gathered to remember a woman who loved fiercely, who fought back even when the odds were impossible, who had been doing nothing more than treating herself to a rare night out when she was taken from the people who needed her most. And Jennifer Bishop's funeral in South Bend was attended by her colleagues from Memorial Hospital, the nurses and doctors who saw trauma every day for a living, but who were completely and utterly unprepared for the trauma of losing one of their own. Jeannie's 3 young children, all under 8 years old, were there. 3 kids who would grow up without their mother, who would reach milestones, graduations, weddings, without her there to see them. Because someone had decided to rob a clothing store on a Saturday morning, Lane Bryant, as a company, responded. Within days, the parent company, Charming Shops Incorporated, put up $50,000 toward a reward for information leading to the arrest of the gunman. The total reward was quickly raised to $100,000. It was one of the largest rewards offered for an unsolved crime in the Chicago area. Lane Bryant also announced the establishment of the Lane Bryant Tinley Park Memorial Fund in honor of the 5 victims. The company offered to pay for all 5 funerals. They did what they could. But no amount of money could bring those women back. Meanwhile, back at the Tinley Park police station, the investigation continued to expand. Detectives were working around the clock. They were pulling phone records from cell towers in the area. They were examining GPS data. They were looking at credit card transactions from the shopping center that morning. They were reviewing every inch of surveillance footage from every camera in and around the Brookside marketplace, hoping to find the gunman on video somewhere, anywhere, even for a split second. And they were looking at the electronic footprint of people who had been in the area. Ed Farrell, the former U.S. Marshals inspector who assisted with the investigation, would later describe this aspect of the work. His team was brought in by the South Suburban Major Crimes Task Force to help identify people who might have been in the vicinity of the store that morning, based on cell phone data, GPS records, and other electronic traces. In the modern world, our phones leave trails everywhere we go. Every cell tower ping, every data transmission, every location marker creates a breadcrumb trail that can put a person at a specific place at a specific time. Investigators hoped that somewhere in those electronic breadcrumbs was the identity of the killer. But the electronic trail, like so much of the evidence in this case, led to dead ends. Or at least, it led to a wall of data that investigators couldn't see past. Not yet, not with the technology available at the time. By the end of February 2008, just a month after the shooting, the investigation had consumed hundreds of man-hours and generated thousands of pages of reports. Tips were coming in at a steady clip. Every lead was being followed. Every name that came across the tip line was being checked against the suspect description, against alibis, against records, against anything that might connect them to the crime. But nobody was arrested. Nobody was even publicly named as a person of interest. The sketch was out there. The voice was out there. The reward was out there. And the killer remained invisible. Tinley Park increased its budget for the Lane Bryant investigation. The village committed additional funds specifically for this case, money that would pay for overtime, for forensic testing, for travel to follow leads in other states, for outside analysts to review the evidence with fresh eyes. In future years, the department would request $60,000 annually, earmarked solely for the Lane Bryant case. That tells you how seriously the community took this. They were not letting go, they were not moving on. And the Steve Wilkos Show, which was being taped in Chicago at the time, devoted a portion of an episode to profiling the suspect. Every platform that could amplify the case did. Every media outlet that could run the sketch did. The case was everywhere, it was inescapable. For people in the Chicago area, the Lane Bryant shooting was all anyone talked about for weeks. But here's the cruel reality of a case like this. The loudest moment is always the beginning. The first weeks, the first months, that's when the public attention is at its peak. That's when the phones ring nonstop. That's when every neighbor and coworker is looking at the sketch and wondering. And then, slowly, inevitably, the attention fades. Other stories take over the news cycle. Other crimes happen. Other tragedies demand the public's attention, and the Lane Bryant sketch, which had been on the front page of every newspaper in the region, starts to drift toward the back pages, and then off the pages entirely. The investigation didn't fade, the detectives didn't stop, but the public momentum did, and as the months turned into the first year, and the first year into the second, and the second into the third, the Lane Bryant shooting became something else entirely. It became a cold case with 5 dead women, a cold case with a surviving witness, a cold case with DNA evidence, a cold case with a suspect sketch, a cold case with the killer's voice on tape, a cold case with surveillance footage of 2 suspicious vehicles, a cold case with a $100,000 reward. By any measure, this should not have been a cold case. There was too much evidence, too many leads, too many resources devoted to it. This was not a murder that happened in a dark alley with no witnesses. This was a mass shooting in a suburban shopping center on a Saturday morning. There was a survivor who looked the killer in the face for 40 minutes. There was a 911 call with his voice on it. There was possible DNA. There were vehicles caught on camera. There was $100,000 waiting for anyone who could provide the piece that made it all come together. And yet, the first anniversary passed, then the second, then the fifth, and the man who had walked into Lane Bryant on the morning of February 2, 2008, carrying a stack of papers and a .40 caliber Glock and a roll of duct tape, remained a ghost. The question that consumed investigators, the question that consumed the families, the question that consumed the community, was no longer just who did this. It was something deeper, something more troubling, something that spoke to the very nature of this crime and the very nature of the man who committed it. The question was why? Why this store? Why Lane Bryant? Why a women's clothing store in a suburban shopping center with $400 in the registers? Why would anyone plan a robbery of a location where the take would be so pathetically small? Why bring duct tape? Why spend 40 minutes inside? Why sexually assault victims during what was supposed to be a robbery? Why execute everyone instead of simply taking the money and running? Nothing about this crime fit the profile of a typical armed robbery. Typical armed robbers want speed. They want to be in and out in minutes. They want cash and valuables, and then they want to disappear. They don't bring duct tape. They don't bind victims. They don't spend the better part of an hour inside the target location. They certainly don't execute every single witness. That's not robbery. That's something else. Was the robbery just a cover? Was the real motive something darker? Was this man after the money, or was he after the women? The sexual element of the crime, the groping, the degradation, the use of underwear as blindfolds, all of it pointed towards something beyond simple financial gain. This man didn't just want their money. He wanted control. He wanted power. He wanted to dominate and humiliate and ultimately destroy. And that changes the entire equation. Because if this wasn't really about money, if this was about something else entirely, then the investigative profile shifts. You're not looking for a desperate man who needed quick cash. You're looking for a predator. You're looking for someone who planned this, who prepared for this, who may have even fantasized about this before carrying it out. Someone who brought duct tape because he intended to restrain his victims from the very beginning. Someone who entered through the back door because he had scouted the location. Someone who posed as a delivery man because he had thought about how to gain access without raising suspicion. This was a man with a plan. And the plan wasn't just robbery. Investigators grappled with this. The crime was officially classified as a robbery gone wrong, but behind closed doors. Detectives were exploring every possible motive. Was this a targeted attack? Did the gunman know any of the victims? Was there a personal connection to someone in the store? Or was this truly random? A horrific convergence of a dangerous predator and 6 women who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. By all indications, it was random. None of the victims had any known connection to a man matching the suspect's description. None of them had reported being stalked or threatened. None of them had enemies who fit the profile. The randomness was part of what made this crime so terrifying. These women didn't do anything wrong. They didn't make a bad decision. They didn't put themselves in harm's way. They went shopping. That's all they did. They went shopping on a Saturday morning at a store in a neighborhood they trusted, and they died for it. And the man who killed them walked out the door and vanished into the cold February air. He got in a vehicle, or he was picked up by accomplices in 2 vehicles, and he drove away. He drove away from 5 dead women and 1 woman playing dead in a pool of blood, and he went somewhere. He went home or to a motel or to another state. He changed his clothes, maybe he shaved his head. Maybe he took out the green beads. Maybe he threw the gun in a river or a lake or a dumpster. And then he went about his life. He ate dinner, he went to sleep. He woke up the next day and saw his face on the news, saw the sketch that Martha had helped create, and he kept going. He kept living. While 5 families buried their mothers and sisters and daughters and wives, he kept living. And that is perhaps the most infuriating part of this entire story. Somebody out there knows this man. Somebody has looked at that sketch and recognized the face. Somebody has listened to that 9/11 tape and recognized the voice. Somebody knows where he was that morning. Somebody knows what he did. Whether it's a friend or a family member or a cellmate or a girlfriend or a neighbor, somebody out there holds the key to this case. And for more than 18 years, that person has stayed silent. The investigation was about to enter a new phase. As the months ticked by and the immediate leads dried up, detectives would turn their attention to new strategies, new theories, and new possibilities. They would look at this crime from angles that hadn't been explored yet. They would bring in outside experts, forensic consultants, criminal profilers, anyone who might offer a fresh perspective on a case that had resisted resolution, and the questions would only multiply. Because the deeper investigators looked into the Lane Bryant shooting, the stranger it became. The timeline didn't add up. The motive didn't make sense. The gunman's behavior inside the store was bizarre and contradictory, and the theory that he might have had accomplices opened up an entirely new universe of possibilities and suspects. The Lane Bryant case was far from over. In some ways it was just beginning. Let me break down for you exactly why this case has haunted investigators for so long. Because on the surface, the Lane Bryant shooting seems like it should have been solvable. You've got a surviving eyewitness. You've got the killer's voice on a 9/11 tape. You've got a detailed composite sketch. You've got possible DNA evidence. You've got surveillance footage of 2 getaway vehicles. You've got a $100,000 reward. You've got the full way the FBI, the Illinois State Police, the Attorney General's office, and a dedicated multi-agency task force. By all accounts, this is a case that has more evidence than 90% of cold cases in America. And yet it has defied resolution for over 18 years. To understand why, you need to look at the contradictions. Because this crime is full of them. It's full of things that don't fit together. Things that point in one direction and then immediately veer in another. Tinley Park Police Commander Patrick McCain put it perfectly when he said, "If I were to make a best guess, it was probably a robbery that failed." However, every time we focus on one thing, there's something in there that just doesn't fit right. That statement tells you everything. Even the lead investigators couldn't make the pieces of this puzzle fit. Every time they thought they had a handle on the motive, on the type of criminal they were dealing with, something threw them off. Something contradicted the theory. Something made them go back to the drawing board. So let's go through the contradictions one by one, because this is where the case gets truly strange. Contradiction number 1. The target. If this was a robbery, why Lane Bryant? Think about it. You're planning a haul to risk your freedom, possibly your life, to steal money.
Where do you go? A bank.
A jewelry store. A gas station with a full register at the end of a busy night. No. This man went to a women's plus-size clothing store at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. A store that had 2 cash registers with about $200 in each, $400 total. That's it. That's the entire potential take. Former Lane Bryant employees confirmed this. One of them told reporters that their customers rarely used cash. Most paid with credit cards or checks. The registers were kept deliberately low. There was no safe full of money in the back. There was no diamond display case. There was no reason for a rational thief to target this location. And it wasn't just the money. The timing was wrong too. Saturday morning, just after opening, is about the worst possible time to rob a retail store. The registers haven't accumulated any cash from sales yet. There are no bags of deposit money waiting to be taken to the bank. If you wanted to maximize your take from a robbery, you'd hit the store at closing time on a Saturday night, when the registers were full from a day's worth of sales. Not at 10 in the morning when the store has been open for 5 minutes. So why Lane Bryant? Why that store? Why that morning? The answer either lies in something we don't know, some connection between the gunman and the store or someone inside it, or the robbery wasn't really the point at all. Contradiction number 2. The time spent inside, 40 minutes. The gunman spent approximately 40 minutes inside that Lane Bryant store. From the moment he walked in around 1:05 a.m. to the moment the shots were fired around 1:44 a.m. Nearly 3/4 of an hour passed. That is an eternity for a robbery. Most armed robberies are over in 2 to 3 minutes. The criminal comes in, makes demands, takes the money and bolts. Speed is everything in a robbery, because every second you spend inside the target location is a second closer to getting caught. Every minute is another opportunity for someone to call the police, for a customer to walk in, for something to go wrong. But this man took his time. He spent 15 minutes chatting with the employees, maintaining his delivery man act, talking casually while Rhoda tried to verify the delivery with another store location. Then he spent another 25 minutes controlling the situation, finding the women, taking their money and jewelry, sexually assaulting at least one of them, and dealing with additional customers who kept walking in. Maurice Hamilton, Rhoda's brother, later asked one of the most haunting questions about this case. He said, "Why did you spend so much time in that store with them? Did you get to know them? Did you know their names?" That question has no good answer. A robber wouldn't spend 40 minutes with his victims. A robber wouldn't chat and linger and take his time. A robber would want to be in and out as fast as humanly possible. The fact that this man stayed for nearly an hour suggests that either he was deeply inexperienced and didn't know what he was doing, or the robbery was secondary to something else entirely. Contradiction number 3. The level of preparation versus the level of chaos. On one hand, this man came prepared. He entered through the back door, which suggests he had scouted the store beforehand and knew the layout. He carried a stack of papers to sell his delivery man disguise. He brought duct tape to restrain his victims. He carried a loaded, .40 caliber Glock. He may have had accomplices waiting in vehicles outside. All of this points to a planned operation. A man who thought this through, who prepared, who had a strategy. But on the other hand, his behavior inside the store was increasingly chaotic. He spent 15 minutes maintaining a cover story that was falling apart in real time, because Rhoda was actively trying to verify it. He didn't seem to have a plan for what to do when additional customers walked in. He lost his composure as the situation evolved. He sexually assaulted a victim during what was supposed to be a time-sensitive criminal act, and the total take from the robbery was roughly $200 in cash and some jewelry. $200. For a man who came with duct tape and a Glock and possibly a team of accomplices. The preparation says professional. The execution says amateur. These two things don't go together. And that disconnect has troubled investigators from the very beginning. Contradiction number 4. The execution of the victims. This is the darkest and most confusing element of this crime. Let's set aside for a moment the horror of what happened and look at it from a purely strategic standpoint, the way an investigator would. If this was a robbery, and the gunman had already gotten whatever money and jewelry he could get, why didn't he just leave? The women were bound. They were blindfolded with underwear. They were lying face down on the floor of a back room. They couldn't see him. They couldn't chase him. By the time they freed themselves and called for help, he could have been miles away. But he didn't leave. He shot all 6 of them in the head, execution style. That decision changed everything about this crime. It turned a robbery into a mass murder. It turned a potential prison sentence into a potential death penalty case. And it made no tactical sense if the goal was simply to steal money and get away clean. Criminal profilers who analyzed this case had a theory about why the gunman executed the women. John Kelly, a criminal profiler who worked the case through his organization called Stealth Inc., believed the gunman likely had prior experience in crime and possibly prior incarceration. His theory was that the man entered the store without a mask because he never intended to leave witnesses alive. The lack of a disguise wasn't carelessness. It was a statement of intent. He planned to kill everyone from the moment he walked in. Kelly told reporters that he believed the man was walking in without a mask, so he planned on killing going in. It was witness disposal. He thought he killed everyone who could identify him. Two other prominent criminal profilers, Greg McCrary and Clint Van Zandt, who had been part of the team that identified the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, also weighed in on the Lane Bryant case. They shared their profile with the press and offered their assessment of the kind of person who would commit this crime. McCrary and Van Zandt believed the killer had likely been incarcerated before. His willingness to execute multiple women without hesitation, without apparent remorse, without any of the usual markers of panic or reluctance that you see in first-time killers, all of it suggested a man who had crossed the threshold of violence long before February 2, 2008. They believed he had vowed to never go back to prison. That the decision to kill the witnesses was a calculated choice made by a man who knew what incarceration was like and who had decided he would do anything, kill anyone, to avoid going back. Van Zandt went even further. He warned that if the gunman felt that anyone was in a position to help police catch him, he would kill again, even if it was his girlfriend or relative, or someone else close to him. In other words, this wasn't just a man who had killed during a robbery. This was a man who would kill to protect his secret, and that meant that anyone who what he had done was in danger. That assessment raises a chilling possibility. What if someone out there knows who the Lane Bryant killer is but is too afraid to come forward? Not just reluctant, not just pathetic, genuinely afraid for their life. What if the reason this case has remained unsolved for 18 years isn't that nobody knows who did it, but that the people who do know are terrified of what he'd do to them if they talk? Now let me take you deeper into the investigative theories that developed over the years, because each one opens a different door into this mystery. Theory number 1. The botched robbery. This is the official theory, the one that Tinley Park police have maintained from the beginning. The idea is simple. A man decided to rob Lane Bryant. He came in with a plan. The plan went sideways. The 9/11 call spooked him, and in a moment of panic and desperation, he executed the witnesses and fled. There's a logic to this theory. The gunman did demand money. He did take cash from the registers and from the victims personally. He did take jewelry. He was carrying the tools of a robbery, a weapon, and restraints. And the execution of the witnesses can be explained as a desperate act by a man who knew he had spent too much time inside, and who realized that the women could identify him. The problem with this theory is everything I've already outlined. The target makes no sense for a robbery. The time spent inside makes no sense. The sexual element makes no sense. And the total take of roughly $200 doesn't justify the level of planning and risk involved. Nobody brings duct tape and a Glock and possibly 2 getaway vehicles to steal $200 from a women's clothing store. Theory number 2. The sexually motivated attack. Some investigators and profilers have suggested that the primary motive wasn't robbery at all but sexual gratification. The gunman sexually assaulted at least one of the victims. He used underwear to blindfold them. He spent an unusually long time with them in a confined space. And the target was a women's clothing store, a location where the victims would be exclusively female. Under this theory, the robbery was a cover, a way to explain his presence in the store and to control the victims. The real motive was power and sexual domination. He wanted to be in a room full of helpless women. He wanted control. He wanted to degrade them. And when the situation spiraled out of control, when Rhoda called 911 and the clock started ticking, he killed them to eliminate the witnesses to what he had done. This theory explains some of the contradictions. It explains why he targeted a women's clothing store. It explains why he spent so long inside. It explains the sexual assault. But it also raises its own questions. If sexual gratification was the primary motive, why didn't the assault go further? Why didn't he undress the victims? Why did the sexual component seem almost secondary, almost like an afterthought in the middle of a robbery? The behavior doesn't fully fit the profile of a sexually motivated offender. Theory number 3. The targeted attack disguised as a robbery. This is the theory that keeps investigators up at night. What if the gunman knew someone in that store? What if one of those 6 women was the real target, and the others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Investigators looked into this early on. They poured through the backgrounds of all 6 women, the 5 who died and the 1 who survived. They looked for connections. They looked for enemies. They looked for anyone in any of their lives who matched the description of the suspect. And they came up empty. None of the victims had any known connection to a man who fit the profile. None of them had reported threats or stalking. None of them had any obvious reason to be targeted. But absence of evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence. It's possible that a connection existed that investigators never uncovered. Maybe it was a casual acquaintance, someone who had seen one of the women somewhere, at a bar, at a store, at a gas station, and became fixated on her. Maybe it was someone who knew the schedule at Lane Bryant and knew that a certain employee would there on Saturday mornings. The part-time employee Martha worked there every weekend. If someone had been watching the store, they would have known that. The problem with this theory, that it doesn't fully explain the gunman's behavior either. If one person was the target, why rob the store? Why take the money? Why bring duct tape for multiple victims? The entire setup suggests that the man expected to encounter multiple people and was prepared to deal with all of them from the beginning. Theory number 4. The accomplice theory. This is the theory that the surveillance footage supports. 2 vehicles, a dark SUV and a dark sedan, pulled up near the Lane Bryant store around the time of the shooting and left within a minute of each other, immediately after the murders. Former U.S. Marshals Inspector Ed Farrell described the footage and said it was believed that the gunman had accomplices, that the vehicles arrived to facilitate his escape. If this is true, then the Lane Bryant shooting was not the act of a lone criminal. It was a coordinated operation involving at least 3 people. The gunman inside the store and at least 2 drivers outside. This changes the profile entirely. This isn't a desperate man acting alone on impulse. This is a team, a crew. People who planned this together, who discussed it beforehand, who assigned roles and coordinated their movements. And if there were accomplices, then there are at least 2 other people out there who know exactly who committed the Lane Bryant murders. 2 other people who helped a mass murderer escape. 2 other people who have been carrying this secret for 18 years. The accomplice theory also helps explain some of the contradictions. The long time spent inside the store might make more sense if the gunman knew he had a guaranteed escape waiting for him outside. He wasn't in a rush because he knew his ride was there. The chaotic behavior might be explained by communication failures between the gunman and his accomplices. Maybe things weren't going according to plan. Maybe the accomplices were signaling him to hurry up. Maybe the plan fell apart and the execution of the witnesses was a panicked decision by a man who realized everything had gone sideways. Theory number 5. The transient offender. Retired Chicago Police Commander Mark Buslick offered a theory that the gunman may not have been from the Tinley Park area at all. The Brookside Marketplace sits right off Interstate 80. A transient criminal, someone passing through the area, someone with no ties to the community, could have pulled off the highway, spotted the shopping center, and decided to hit a store on impulse. After the shooting, he could have gotten right on the highway and continued driving. He could have been in Indiana within 30 minutes, in Iowa by the end of the day, in another part of the country within 4 hours. If this theory is correct, it explains why the composite sketch and the 9/11 tape haven't produced a match. Nobody in the Tinley Park area recognizes the man because he doesn't live there. He doesn't work there. He has no ties there. He was a phantom, a ghost who materialized on a cold February morning and then dissolved back to American landscape. Buslick also raised another possibility. He said that one reason the suspect hasn't been connected to the crime through DNA or other evidence may be that the suspect is dead. Maybe he died in the years after the shooting. Maybe he was killed in another crime. Maybe he overdosed. Maybe succumbed to illness. If the killer died before his DNA was ever entered into a law enforcement database, then the genetic evidence that police collected from the Lane Bryant scene would have nothing to match against. It would just be a profile sitting in a file, waiting for a comparison that never comes. That's a devastating possibility for the families. Because if the killer is dead, they may never get answers. They may never know who he was. They may never know why he did what he did. The chance for justice, for a trial, for a conviction, for someone to look them in the eye and be held accountable, that chance may have died with the killer. Now let me tell you about some of the specific leads that investigators pursued over the years, because each one felt like it could be the breakthrough. And each one led nowhere. In mid-February 2008, barely 2 weeks after the shooting, a man was questioned in connection with the case. The circumstances aren't entirely public, but the questioning was significant enough to make the news. Police ultimately determined that this man was not the Lane Bryant gunman, and he was released. In March of 2008, a suspect in Nevada drew investigators' attention. Something about this person triggered a connection to the Lane Bryant case, whether it was a physical resemblance to the sketch, a criminal history that matched the profile, or something else entirely. Investigators traveled to Nevada to look into it, and once again the lead fizzled. The Nevada suspect was not the Tinley Park gunman. In July of 2008, the investigation reportedly turned to Texas. Another lead, another state. Another possibility that the killer had fled far from Illinois after the shooting. Details about the Texas lead are scarce, but whatever investigators found, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. In September of 2008, 7 months after the shooting, the FBI returned to the Lane Bryant store to conduct additional forensic testing. This is significant because it suggests that investigators had identified new areas of interest within the crime scene, or had developed new theories about what evidence might be hidden there. The store had been closed to the public since the shooting. It sat there dark and empty, in the middle of a bustling shopping center, a permanent reminder of what had happened within its walls. And every time a lead was pursued and cleared, every time a suspect was questioned and released, every time a tip turned out to be nothing, the weight of this case grew heavier. For the detectives. For the family, Detective Ray Violetto, who had been assigned as the lead investigator on the case, became something of a one-man army. He worked the case relentlessly. He followed up on every tip. He re-examined the evidence. He consulted with outside experts. His partner, Detective Tim Poulos, worked alongside him, and together they built one of the most comprehensive case files in Tinley Park history. The department still averaged about a tip and a half per week, even years after the shooting, and every single one was investigated. Violetto also reached out to the Vidocq Society, a prestigious organization made up of current and former law enforcement professionals, FBI profilers, coroners, forensic scientists, and other experts who volunteer their time to help solve difficult cases. The Vidocq Society reviewed the Lane Bryant case and provided their input. According to Violetto, the Society's contributions were valuable for 2 reasons. First, they validated the work that had already been done, confirming that investigators were on the right track. Second, they offered new ideas and suggestions, fresh angles that the detectives hadn't yet considered. But even with the Vidocq Society's help, even with the FBI's assistance, even with thousands of tips and millions of dollars in resources, the case remained unsolved. Police Chief Steve Neubauer, who led the department for years during the investigation, described the Lane Bryant shooting as an unusual crime. He said that crimes like this don't happen around the nation with any regularity. He compared it to the Brown's Chicken Massacre, the infamous 1993 case in which 7 people were murdered at a fast food restaurant in Palatine, Illinois, just 30 miles north of Tinley Park. That comparison was not just about geography or the number of victims, it was about hope. Because the Brown's Chicken case had also gone cold. For 9 long years, nobody knew who had killed those 7 people. The case seemed unsolvable. And then in 2002, a breakthrough. A woman came forward and told police that the killers had confessed to her shortly after the murders. DNA evidence from a half-eaten piece of chicken that had been preserved from the crime scene in 1993 confirmed the identity of the killers. After 9 years of nothing, the case was solved. Detective Violetto studied the Brown's chicken case closely. He saw the parallels, he saw the hope. If a 9-year-old cold case with multiple murder victims could be cracked by a combination of new technology and a single brave witness coming forward, then maybe the same thing could happen with Lane Bryant. And as the years passed, technology did advance. Dramatically, DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Genetic genealogy, the technique that was used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, opened up entirely new possibilities for matching forensic evidence to individuals through family trees. Audio enhancement technology improved, offering the potential to extract more information from the 9/11 tape. Facial recognition software advanced to levels that were unimaginable in 2008. In 2018, on the 10-year anniversary of the shooting, police released a new composite image of the suspect. This wasn't a traditional sketch. It was a 3-dimensional modeled image created by Michigan State Police using the latest facial identification technology. The image was based on Martha's original description from 2008, but it was rendered in a way that was far more lifelike, more realistic, more immediately recognizable than a hand-drawn sketch. It showed a face that looked a photograph rather than an illustration. It showed what the suspect might actually look like in real life. The image was also aged up. In 2008, the suspect had been estimated to be between 25 and 35 years old. By 2018, he would have been between 35 and 45. The new image reflected that aging, showing a slightly older man, a man who might have gained some weight, who might have changed his hairstyle, who might look different enough from the original sketch that people who knew him in 2008 might not immediately connect the two images. Police released the new image alongside enhanced audio from the 9/11 tape. They put it all out there. A face, a voice, a $100,000 reward. And they asked the public one more time to look and listen. To think, to remember, to come forward if anything triggered a memory. The tips came in. Some were promising, most were dead ends. And the case remained unsolved, but the technology kept advancing. And improvements in fingerprint analysis, DNA processing, and shell casing identification continued to provide new tools that weren't available in 2008. Every few years, investigators would submit the evidence for reanalysis, using whatever the latest technology happened to be. They were playing the long game. They were betting that someday, the technology would catch up to the evidence, and the pieces would finally fall into place. By 2023, the 15th anniversary of the shooting, police had received over 7,500 tips related to the case. 7,500. That's an astonishing number for a case that's 15 years old. It meant that the public hadn't completely forgotten. It meant that people were still looking at that sketch, still listening to that voice, still thinking about those 5 women who died on a cold February morning. But it also meant that the right tip, the one that cracked the case, still hadn't come in. 7,500 attempts, and not one of them was the one. Not one of them was the person who knew the killer, who recognized the face, who heard the voice and felt that chill of recognition. The families were struggling. Every February when the anniversary rolled around and the media picked up the story again, the wounds were reopened. Every news article, every television segment, every podcast episode brought them right back to that morning. Right back to the phone call that told them their mother, their sister, their daughter, their wife, was gone. Jennifer Bishop's sister, Michelle Talos, captured the complex emotions of the families perfectly. She said that 2 weeks after the shooting, when the killer hadn't been found, she had a feeling they would never find him. And then she added something that was startlingly honest. She said, "I don't know if that's because I don't really want him to reappear in our lives." Think about that for a moment. A woman who lost her sister to a mass shooter, acknowledging that part of her doesn't want the killer found, because finding him would mean reliving the worst moment of her life. It would mean a trial. It would mean testimony. It would mean sitting in a courtroom across from the man who murdered her sister and looking at his face every day for weeks or months. It would mean the case being back in the news, back on the front page, back in the center of her life. She had built a fragile piece around the wound, and finding the killer would tear that piece apart. That's what an unsolved case does to families. It doesn't just deny them justice. It traps them in a permanent state of unresolution. They can't fully grieve because there's no closure. They can't fully heal because the wound keeps being opened. They can't move on because every anniversary, every news story, every well-meaning stranger who says they'll catch him someday pulls them back. Carrie Chuso's mother, Penny Hudick, took a different approach. She was angry. She was determined. And she directed her frustration not just at the killer, but at the people who might know something and hadn't come forward. She said, somebody who knows and doesn't come forward, they're just as guilty as the person who did it. Rhoda McFarlane's brother Morris maintained his hope. Year after year, he showed up at press conferences and memorial events and said the same thing. Somebody will be caught one day soon. Justice can be served, and the next press conference we have is when the guy got caught. And Carrie Chuso's brother, Mike Hudick, carried the anger for years before something shifted inside him. By the 18th anniversary, he told reporters that he had forgiven the killer. Not because the killer deserved forgiveness, but because Mike couldn't keep going down the dark rabbit hole of what if and why. He said it didn't matter anymore. The anger was consuming him, and he had to let it go to survive. Forgiveness. From a man whose sister was executed in a clothing store. That takes a kind of strength that most of us will never fully understand. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the investigation continued. New detectives were assigned to the case as older ones retired or were promoted. The torch was passed, but the fire never went out. The multi-agency task force continued to meet. The evidence was examined with each new generation of forensic technology, and the Tinley Park Police Department continued to dedicate significant financial resources to the case, requesting tens of thousands of dollars annually from the village budget specifically for the Lane Bryant investigation. The questions that had haunted this case from the very beginning, the questions about motive and identity and opportunity, those questions were still there, still unanswered, still hanging in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. But something was changing in the landscape around this case. New voices were starting to speak up. New perspectives were emerging. And a growing chorus of critics was starting to ask uncomfortable questions, not just about the killer, but about the investigation itself. Had the police done everything they could? Had they made mistakes? Had they missed something? Were they too focused on one theory and blind to others? Those questions were about to get very loud. Let me take you back to the Brookside Marketplace for a moment. Because what happened to that shopping center in the years after the shooting tells its own story. A story about grief and memory and the impossible tension between wanting to remember and needing to move on. After the shooting, the Lane Bryant store never reopened. The door stayed locked. The lights stayed off. The yellow police tape came down eventually, but the emptiness remained. For months, and then years, that storefront sat there in the middle of a busy shopping center, like a wound that wouldn't close. Shoppers would walk past it on their way to Target or PetSmart, and look at the dark glass and think about what happened behind it. Some would pause. Some would hurry past. Some would place flowers against the door frame even years later. The rest of the Brookside Marketplace tried to carry on. Other stores kept their doors open. New businesses moved into neighboring storefronts. Life went on as it always does, even in the shadow of tragedy. But that one space remained vacant. Nobody wanted it. No business wanted to be the one to set up shop in a place where 5 women had been executed. It was as if the building itself had been marked. For 6 years, it stayed empty. 6 years of that dark storefront staring out at the parking lot where the police had swarmed on that cold February morning. 6 years of a void in the center of a shopping complex that was otherwise bustling with activity. The Brookside Marketplace struggled in that section. The Lane Bryant building became a drag on the whole area, a constant reminder that kept some shoppers away entirely. Then, in the fall of 2013, it was announced that T.J. Maxx had signed a lease to take over the space. The building was remodeled. The interior was gutted and rebuilt, new walls, new floors, new lighting, new everything. By the time T.J. Max opened its doors on November 7, 2013. The physical space bore no resemblance to the Lane Bryant store that had once occupied it. Every trace of that store had been stripped away and replaced. The opening was a complicated moment for Tinley Park. Then Mayor Ed Zabrocki called it bittersweet. He said it was bitter because it reminded everyone what had happened there, but it was also a sign that the community was moving on. Businesses were moving in. The area was healing. TJ Maxx acknowledged the history of the location. They held a moment of silence at the ribbon cutting. They donated $10,000 to a Tinley Park charity, called together in honor of the 5 victims. They tried to be respectful. They tried to do the right thing, but not everyone was happy. Some residents wanted the building torn down entirely. They wanted a memorial erected on the spot where those 5 women had died. They felt that turning a murder scene into a discount clothing store was disrespectful, no matter how many donations were made or moments of silence were observed. One commenter on a local news site wrote that she would never enter that store. She said she honored her intuition and her instincts, which gave her feelings of discomfort at the thought of shopping there. Others took a more pragmatic view. One shopper said simply, "You keep living. It just seems like crime is everywhere." Life goes on, and life did go on. People shop at that TJ Maxx today. They browse the racks and try on shoes and stand in line at the register. And most of them probably don't know that 5 women were killed in that very building. The younger generation, the teenagers and 20-somethings who shop there now, may have never even heard of the Lane Bryant shooting. The physical evidence of the crime has been erased. The building has been transformed. But for the people who were there, for the families, for the investigators, the memory hasn't been remodeled. It's still there. Raw, unchanged, permanent. Kristen Seville, a local resident who attended a screening of the documentary about the case years later, said something that captured this perfectly. She said that she and other residents still have a heightened awareness when shopping at stores in the Brookside Marketplace. Even after all these years, even with the new store and the new paint and the new shelves, the awareness is still there. The feeling that something terrible happened in this place, that something terrible could happen again. That's what a crime like this does to a community. It doesn't just take lives, it takes the sense of safety. It takes the ability to walk into a store on a Saturday morning without a flicker of fear in the back of your mind. And that feeling doesn't go away just because the building gets a new coat of paint. Now let's talk about the criticism that has surrounded this investigation, because it's important to understanding why this case has generated so much frustration and anger over the years. From the very beginning, the Tinley Park Police Department made it clear that they intended to keep the details of their investigation close to the chest. They described the case as extremely sensitive on multiple occasions. They declined to share specifics about the forensic evidence. They didn't reveal what was on the full 9/11 tape beyond the brief snippet that was released to the public. They didn't discuss their theories or name persons of interest. They operated in near total secrecy, releasing only what they felt was absolutely necessary to generate tips from the public. On one hand, this is standard police procedure in a major homicide investigation. You don't want to tip off the suspect. You don't want to compromise evidence that might be critical in a future trial. You want to hold back details that only the killer would know so that you can use them to verify or eliminate suspects during interrogation. There are good reasons for investigative secrecy, and any experienced detective will tell you that releasing too much information can actually hurt a case rather than help it. But on the other hand, the Lane Bryant case wasn't getting solved. Year after year after year, the same sketch was on the wall. The same 9/11 snippet was on the website. The same basic description of the suspect was repeated in every anniversary news story, and the families were left in the dark. The public was left in the dark. And a growing number of people started to wonder whether the police were keeping things secret because they had a strategic reason to, or because they simply didn't have much to share. One of the most vocal critics of the investigation has been Charlie Min, a filmmaker and former producer for America's Most Wanted who spent 4 months creating a documentary about the Lane Bryant case. The film, titled Who Killed These Women? The Tinley Park Five, debuted in February of 2026 at theaters in the Chicago area. Min did not hold back in his criticism of the Tinley Park Police Department. He called them aloof. He said they were soft and gutless. He said they had not solved the case in 18 years and that the families deserved better, a lot better. He pointed out that the Bryant shooting is the largest unsolved mass shooting in modern American history, a distinction that should have brought far more resources, far more urgency, and far more results than what the Tinley Park Police Department had delivered. Min was particularly troubled by the fact that the police refused to participate in his documentary. He reached out to them. He asked for interviews. He asked for information, and they declined. They said they wouldn't comment because of the sensitive and ongoing nature of the investigation. That phrase, sensitive and ongoing, had become a kind of shield, a standard response that the department used every time someone asked a pointed question about why the case hadn't been solved. And Min pushed back against that. He said that residents of Tinley Park should challenge their police department for not solving this. He said that the community couldn't just keep saying the same thing every anniversary, repeating the same platitudes about being committed to finding the killer while the years ticked by and nothing changed. He wanted action. He wanted results. He wanted somebody to be held accountable for the fact that 5 women had been massacred in broad daylight, and nobody had been arrested. The documentary itself included a reenactment of the shooting, interviews with family members of the victims, conversations with paramedics who responded to the scene, discussions with former Bryant employees, and analysis from experts. It was a visceral, emotional film that put the audience in the middle of the horror, and then asked them to sit with the frustration of an unsolved case. More than 1,000 tickets were sold across 4 theaters in the Chicago area in the first few days after the film's release. At one screening in Olin Park, just 7 miles from the Brookside Marketplace, more than 50 people sat in the theater and watched a reenactment of the murders that had happened practically in their backyard. The reactions were mixed. Some viewers praised the film for bringing renewed attention to a case that had faded from public consciousness. Wilma Swanson, a woman from Petone who called herself and her friends Granny Crime Solvers, said the film gave her new theories about the case and inspired her to get involved. She wanted to start a Facebook group to discuss the case, to share ideas, to keep the conversation going. Others were disturbed by the documentary's aggressive tone toward the police. Debbie Melchert, a Tinley Park resident, said the film included what she described as constant bashing of the Tinley Park police. She didn't appreciate it. She wanted to know why anyone would expect the police to release details from an active investigation. She said she was grateful that the victims' brothers, who were interviewed in the film, refused to blame anyone except the killer, even when she felt the filmmaker asked questions designed to lead them toward criticizing the police. Carol Betley, a longtime Tinley Park resident, had been shopping in the Target across the parking lot on the morning of the shooting. She attended the documentary screening hoping for answers. She said she wondered why the robbery had taken place in the morning, at a store with so little cash on hand. It was the same question that investigators had been asking themselves for 18 years. And then there was the concern about the surviving victim. Several viewers felt that the documentary pushed too hard toward the idea of finding and identifying the woman who had survived the shooting. The survivor, Martha, had deliberately kept her identity private. She had never spoken publicly. She had never appeared on camera. She had given her statement to police and then retreated from the public eye, and she had every right to do so. She had been shot in the neck. She had watched 5 women die. She had played dead in a pool of blood. The trauma she experienced was beyond what most of us can comprehend. Some critics of the documentary felt that the filmmaker's pursuit of the case, while well-intentioned, risked re-traumatizing a woman who had already suffered enough. Others felt that the public's right to answers needed to be balanced against the survivor's right to privacy. It was a complicated ethical question with no easy answer. The Tinley Park Police Department pushed back against Min's criticism. They pointed out that his previous work on the case had generated tips that were unhelpful and had pulled investigative resources away from more productive lines of inquiry. They maintained that their investigation had never stopped. They cited the multi-agency task force, the continued allocation of funds, the ongoing evaluation of evidence using new technology. But Min's most pointed criticism cut to the heart of the matter. He said something that many people had been thinking for years. He said that Tinley Park police would not solve this case. He believed that social media would. He believed that the case would only be cracked when enough awareness was generated among the general public. When enough people saw the sketch and heard the voice, and thought about the case, that someone who had been holding onto a secret for 18 years would finally feel compelled to come forward. And there's an uncomfortable kernel of truth in that assessment. Because the Lane Bryant case has always been, at its core, a case that depends on human information. The forensic evidence, whatever it is, hasn't produced a match. The surveillance footage was too grainy to identify the vehicles. The 9/11 tape hasn't led to a voice identification. All of those things are important. All of them could become the key to solving the case someday, especially as technology advances. But in the absence of a forensic breakthrough, this case is going to be solved by a person. By a human being who knows something and decides to share it. And that brings us to one of the most frustrating aspects of this entire story. The question of who knows. Somebody knows who did this. That's not speculation. That's not wishful thinking. That's a near certainty. A crime this complex, involving at least one person and possibly multiple accomplices, doesn't exist in a vacuum. People talk. Criminals brag. Secrets leak. In the weeks and months after the Lane Bryant shooting, the killer went somewhere. He was around Pia life. He had friends or family or associates. He slept somewhere. He ate meals with someone. He existed in a social world where his absence on the morning of February said would have been noted, where his behavior in the days and weeks after the shooting might have been different, where the sudden appearance of cash, or the disappearance of a gun or a change in hairstyle or a move to a new city might have raised questions. The Brown's chicken case, the one that investigators looked to for hope, was solved because one of the killers confessed to his girlfriend. He told her what he had done. He couldn't keep it inside. And for years, she said nothing. But eventually her conscience caught up with her, or her circumstances changed, or something inside her shifted, and she went to the police. And that confession, combined with DNA evidence from a piece of chicken that had been preserved for 9 years, cracked the case wide open. Is there a girlfriend out there who knows what the Lane Bryant killer did? Is there a buddy he bragged to at a bar? Is there a cellmate he confided in during a stint in prison for some other crime? Is there a family member who noticed the bruises on his hands from where Connie Woolfolk scratched him? Who saw him come home on a Saturday morning, that February, with blood on his clothes? Who heard him say something that didn't quite make sense at the time, but that makes perfect sense now? Penny Hudak, Carrie Chuso's mother, was right when she said that somebody who knows and doesn't come forward is just as guilty as the person who did it. That might sound harsh. But when 5 women are dead and a killer is free, and the only thing standing between justice and impunity is a phone call, the people who are choosing silence are making a choice. And that choice has consequences. Not legal consequences, perhaps, but moral ones. Now let me talk about some of the specific factors that may explain why this case has been so resistant to resolution. Factor 1. The 911 call rerouting. This is a detail that doesn't get enough attention. When Rhoda McFarland dialed 911 from inside the store at approximately 4:04 a.m., her call didn't go directly to the Tinley Park Police Department. It was first received by the Will County Sheriff's Department, and then transferred to Tinley Park. That transfer took time. Not a lot of time. Seconds, probably. But in a situation where the gunman was inside a store with 6 hostages and a loaded weapon, every second mattered. Charlie Min highlighted this in his documentary. He pointed out that the rerouting might have cost precious seconds. Seconds that could have been the difference between catching the killer inside the store and finding him already gone. If the call had gone directly to Tinley Park Dispatch, If the officer in the target parking lot had been notified even 30 seconds earlier, the outcome might have been different. We'll never know. But the rerouting is a wrinkle in the timeline that has frustrated investigators and families alike. Factor 2. The location of the Brookside Marketplace was, from the killer's perspective, almost perfect. It sits minutes from Interstate 80, one of the longest and most heavily traveled highways in America. A person leaving the shopping center parking lot could be on that highway within 3 to 5 minutes. Once on I-80, they head east toward Indiana or west toward Iowa. Within an hour, they could be in another state. Within a few hours, they could be hundreds of miles away. Min himself noted this. He said the interstate would have been a great getaway. He said the killer could be anywhere. And that geographic reality has been a thorn in the side of investigators since day one. If the killer was local, if he lived in Tinley Park or one of the surrounding suburbs, then the sketch and the 9/11 tape and the reward might eventually produce a match. But if he was from out of the area, if he was a transient who pulled off the highway and targeted a random store, and then got right back on the road, then the chances of someone in the Tinley Park area recognizing him dropped dramatically. Factor 3. The lack of security cameras inside the store. This is perhaps the single most devastating gap in the evidence. Lane Bryant did not have security cameras inside the store. There was no video of the gunman entering, no footage of him talking to the employees, no recording of the robbery, the restraining of the victims, or the shooting, nothing. The only video that exists comes from a camera on the Target store across the parking lot, which captured grainy footage of two vehicles near the Lane Bryant entrance around the time of the shooting. That footage was taken from hundreds of feet away. The resolution was poor. The angle was wrong. It was better than nothing, but it was a far cry from the kind of clear, high-definition surveillance video that might have given investigators a license plate number or a clear image of the killer's face. If Lane Bryant had cameras, this case would almost certainly have been solved within days. The killer would have been captured on video from the moment he entered the store. His face, his clothing, his movements, his vehicle, all of it would have been recorded and preserved. Instead, investigators were left with a single witness's memory and a hand-drawn sketch. After the shooting, there was a push among local businesses and the police department to improve security at retail locations throughout Tinley Park and the surrounding area. Police held a security expo for stores in March of 2008, just weeks after the shooting, to encourage business owners to install cameras and adopt safety protocols. The Lane Bryant shooting became a cautionary tale about what happens when a crime occurs in a space with no electronic eyes watching. Factor 4. The killer's apparent discipline. This is something that the profilers noticed and that investigators have struggled with. The Lane Bryant killer, for all his chaotic behavior inside the store, displayed a remarkable level of discipline when it came to evidence management. He didn't leave a weapon behind. He apparently didn't leave fingerprints that could be matched to anyone in the system. He didn't drop a wallet or a phone or any personal item that could have identified him. He managed to exit the store, get into a vehicle, and leave the area without being seen by anyone who could provide a useful description of his escape. Criminal profiler John Kelly noted that the killer entered without a mask. That's significant. In most armed robberies, the perpetrator makes at least some effort to conceal their identity. A ski mask, a bandana, a hoodie pulled tight, sunglasses, something. This man walked in with his face fully visible. His hairstyle was distinctive, his clothing was distinctive. The green beads on his braid were distinctive. He made no effort to disguise himself. Kelly interpreted this as evidence that the killer always intended to eliminate the witnesses. He wasn't worried about being seen because he planned to make sure nobody survived to describe him. The lack of a mask wasn't carelessness. It was confidence. The confidence of a man who believed he was going to kill every person who saw his face. And he nearly succeeded. If Martha hadn't turned her head at the last possible second, if the bullet had hit her squarely instead of grazing her neck, there would have been no surviving witness. No description. No sketch. No composite image. The police would have had nothing but 6 dead women, a collection of shell casings, and a crime scene with no eyes to tell the story. That's how close this case came to being even more hopeless than it already is. 1 inch, one fraction of a second, one involuntary flinch of a woman's head. That's all that separated total darkness from the single ray of light that investigators have been working with for 18 years. Factor 5. The passage of time. Time is the enemy of every unsolved case. Memories fade, witnesses move away or die. Physical evidence degrades. People who might have been willing to come forward in the first year or two become entrenched in their silence as the years pile up. The longer a secret is kept, the harder it becomes to break it. A person who has stayed quiet for 18 years has built their entire post-crime life around that silence. Coming forward now would mean not only revealing the secret, but also admitting that they've been harboring it for nearly 2 decades. The weight of that admission is enormous, and the killer himself has changed. If he was 25 to 35 in 2008, he's now in his mid-40s to mid-50s. His appearance has changed, his hair is different. He may have gained weight or lost weight. He may have aged in ways that make the original sketch or even the 2018 three-dimensional composite unrecognizable. The man who walks through the world today may look nothing like the man who walked into Lane Bryant on February 2, 2008. But here's what hasn't changed. His DNA hasn't changed. If police have a workable DNA sample from the crime scene, that genetic profile is as valid today as it was in 2008. And the explosion of genetic genealogy in recent years has opened up possibilities that simply didn't exist a decade ago. The same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, that cracked dozens of other cold cases across the country, could potentially be applied to the Lane Bryant case if the DNA evidence is sufficient. Investigators have acknowledged that they are continually resubmitting evidence for analysis using the latest technology. Every time a new forensic tool becomes available, the Lane Bryant evidence goes back to the lab. They're playing the long game. They're waiting for the technology to catch up. And maybe it will. Maybe someday a DNA match will pop up in a database, or a genetic genealogy search will narrow the field to a family, and then to a person, and then to a name. And 18 years of silence will finally be broken, but the families can't wait forever. And neither can the community. Let me tell you about what the families have done in the years since the shooting, because their stories didn't end on February 7, 2008. They were forced to keep going, to rebuild, to find some way to live with a hole in their lives that could never be filled. Tony Chiuso, Carrie's husband, the man who had been planning to start a family with the love of his life, did something extraordinary in the years after her death. He followed in Carrie's footsteps. He became a teacher. He went into education and dedicated himself to helping young people, the same work that Carrie had devoted her career to. It was his way of honoring her, of keeping her spirit alive, of making sure that the impact she had on the world didn't end with a bullet in a back room. Rhoda McFarlane's brothers, Maurice and Vincent Hamilton, became tireless advocates for solving the case. They showed up at every press conference. They spoke at every anniversary event. They kept Rhoda's name in the public conversation. Maurice said he thought of the killer as a coward and wished nothing but the worst for him. But he also maintained hope. He said the killer would come to justice one day, whether here on earth or before God. Jennifer Bishop's sister Michelle Talos carried the loss quietly but deeply. She described the unique pain of losing a sibling to violence, of having to explain to Jeannie's 3 young children why their mother wasn't coming home. Those children grew up without their mother. They celebrated birthdays without her. They graduated from school without her in the audience. They reached milestones that Jeannie should have been there for, and she wasn't, because of a man with a gun and a roll of duct tape, and a plan that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. Connie Woolfolk's 2 sons lost their mother, the woman who had worked overnight shifts and started a mortgage company, and taken them to doctor's appointments and fought for them every single day. Her youngest, the boy with spina bifida, lost the person who understood his needs better than anyone. The family had to restructure itself around the absence of the person who had held everything together. Sarah Safransky's family lost their oldest daughter at 22. She never got to start her career at CN Financial. She never got to grow into the professional woman she was becoming. She never got to have the life that her education and her talent and her kindness had prepared her for. All of that potential, all of that promise, all of that future was erased in a single morning. These families have carried this weight for 18 years, and they'll carry it until the case is solved or until they pass it on to the next generation, who will carry it after them. Because unsolved murders don't just haunt the people who knew the victims. They haunt the descendants, the grandchildren who never met their grandmother, the nieces and nephews who only know their aunt from photographs, the community that still pauses every February 2nd and remembers. And here we are in 2026, and the case of the Lane Bryant shooting remains open. The tip line is still active. The reward is still available. The sketch is still on the Tinley Park Police Department's website. The 9/11 recording is still there for anyone to listen to. The multi-agency task force, which includes Tinley Park detectives, the Illinois State Police, the FBI's Chicago field office, the Illinois Attorney General's office, and the Will County State's Attorney's office, is still meeting. Still evaluating leads, still testing evidence, and somewhere out there, the man who did this is still breathing. Or he isn't. Maybe Mark Buslick was right. Maybe the killer is dead prison, or in a car accident, or from natural causes, and the secret died with him. Maybe nobody will ever be held accountable for what happened in that store on that morning. Maybe the families will never get the trial, the conviction, the moment where justice is served and they can finally exhale. Or maybe not. Maybe the next tip is the one. Maybe the next advance in DNA technology is the breakthrough. Maybe the next person who looks at that sketch, really looks at it, will feel a jolt of recognition and pick up the phone. The case isn't over. It can't be over. Not as long as those 5 names still mean something to the people who love them. Rhoda McFarland, Sarah Safransky, Carrie Hudek-Chuso, Connie Woolfolk, Jennifer Bishop. 5 women who went shopping on a Saturday morning and never came home. There's another detail about this case that I think deserves attention. Something that gets lost in the larger conversation about motive and evidence and investigative strategy. And it's about the first responders. The people who walked into that back room and saw what the killer had done. Kevin Collins was one of the first paramedics on the scene. He arrived within minutes of the 911 call, and what he found inside that store stayed with him for the rest of his career. He later participated in the documentary, sharing his experience publicly for the first time. He described the scene in the back room, the women lying face down, bound, shot, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that hit him when he realized there was almost nothing he could do for most of them. Collins retired from emergency services, but the Lane Bryant call never fully left him. It was the kind of event that changes the way a person sees the world. You go into work that morning thinking it's going to be a normal shift. A fender bender, maybe a slip and fall, maybe a cardiac event. And instead you walk into a room where 5 women have been executed, and you carry that room with you for the rest of your life. The officers who responded experienced the same thing. Tinley Park was a quiet suburb. The police department handled burglaries and DUs and noise complaints. They were not accustomed to mass murder. The sight of those 5 women in that back room, bound and shot, shattered something in the department that took years to process. Police Chief Mike O'Connell, who had been in tears at the scene, never fully recovered from the emotional toll. He continued to lead the department and push the investigation forward, but the weight of those 5 unsolved murders was always there. O'Connell passed away in 2011 from complications related to heart surgery. He was 60 years old. He never got to see the case solved. T.J. Grady, the sergeant who had been one of the first to speak to the press on the day of the shooting, eventually became a village trustee. Years later, he reflected on the impact the case had on the department and the community. He said it was hard to deal with. A small community with a hometown feeling, and then to have this tragedy take place. It was very tough on a lot of people, and it's still tough. That's the thing about an unsolved case of this magnitude. The trauma doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't fade on a predictable schedule. It sits there somewhere between memory and open wound, and it surfaces whenever you drive past that shopping center, whenever February comes around. Whenever someone mentions the name Lane Bryant, and you see a flicker of something dark cross their face, there's a question that hangs over this entire case like a cloud that never breaks. And it's not who did this. It's not even why. It's the question that every family member, every detective, every person who has ever looked at composite sketches asked themselves at some point. Will this ever be solved? And the honest answer is, I don't know. Nobody does. But I can tell you this. Cases older than the Lane Bryant shooting have been solved. Cases with less evidence have been solved. Cases where the killer seemed to have vanished completely, where decades passed without a single credible lead, have been cracked wide open by a single phone call, a single DNA match, a single moment where someone's conscience finally outweighed their fear. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for over a decade and wasn't identified until 2018, more than 40 years after his crimes. The Brown's Chicken Massacre, the case that Tinley Park investigators have studied and drawn hope from, went unsolved for 9 years before a girlfriend's testimony, and a piece of preserved DNA broke it open. Cold cases are being solved every month now, thanks to genetic genealogy and advances in forensic technology that would have seemed like fiction in 2008. The Lane Bryant case has evidence. It has DNA, it has a voice recording. It has a detailed physical description. It has shell casings and shoe prints and fingerprints. It has the memory of a survivor who looked the killer in the face and lived to describe him. All of those things are tools. And as the technology to analyze those tools continues to improve, the chances of a breakthrough grow. But technology alone won't solve this case. It never has been just about the science. It's about people. It's about the person out there who knows something and hasn't spoken yet. The girlfriend, the cellmate, the cousin, the neighbor who noticed something strange in February of 2008 and pushed it to the back of their mind, and has been living with nagging feeling ever since. If you're that person, if you're listening to this right now and something is stirring inside you, something you've been carrying for years, know this. The tip line is still open. The reward is still there. And the families of Rhoda, Sarah, Carrie, Connie, and Jennifer are still waiting. 18 years is a long time to wait. But they haven't stopped. I want to end this by going back to that morning. A cold Saturday in Tinley Park. Snow on the ground. Temperatures barely above freezing. The kind of morning where you pull your coat a little tighter and move a little faster between your car and the door of whatever store you're heading into. Rhoda McFarland didn't have to be there that day. She wasn't scheduled. She came in on her day off because her employee was opening alone, and Rhoda wasn't the kind of person who let someone struggle by themselves. Sarah Safransky was shopping for clothes for a new job she was excited about. Carrie Chuso was looking for something to wear to a reunion with her college friends. Connie Woolfolk was treating herself on a rare morning off from her overnight shifts. Jennifer Bishop was spending a birthday gift card, browsing the racks while her husband attended a conference nearby. 5 ordinary decisions. Go to work, go shopping, treat yourself, spend a gift card. The kind of choices that every single one of us makes without thinking. Because why would you think twice about walking into a clothing store on a Saturday morning? None of them knew that with a gun and a roll of duct tape was already inside. None of them knew that the next 40 minutes would be the last of their lives. None of them got to say goodbye to the people they loved. And that's the part that stays with me. Not the mystery. Not the investigation. Not the theories or the evidence or the leads that went nowhere. It's the ordinariness of it. The way violence reached into a completely normal morning and destroyed 5 lives and shattered dozens more and left a wound in a community that still hasn't healed almost 2 decades later. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with this story. Thank you for keeping these 5 women in your thoughts, even for just the length of this video. And if you know anything about who walked into that Lane Bryant store on February 2, 2008, the Tinley Park Police tip line is 784394. The email is lanebryant@tinley.park.org. The reward is $100,000. Someone out there has the answer. Maybe it's you. Good night.